our guests. Today we've got Dr. Pam Bruning. She is the president and CEO of Progressive Bridges, which is an education services company, and Jay Burcham, who is president of Provenio Group and developer of Leaps. So let's just jump right into the webinar and get started. So the first question we have is, how do I use problem solving with data for effective results? And this question goes to Pam.
Thank you, Julia. And when we were looking at the questions that our people have submitted, a lot of these questions that you see listed on the screen right here were also a part of this. So we decided to wrap these all together and answer them with a big example. So again, that's a huge question, the whole idea of how do I use problem solving with data for effective results. So let's start with, why should a busy classroom teacher use behavior data anyway? They are busy, but we also know that if we can increase student achievement or student motivation in the classroom, if we can build stronger relationships with students, retain credibility from a student perspective, and model problem solving, all of those things, in addition to the overall positive classroom environment, do increase student achievement. So it is worth our time to do, even in a busy classroom. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that many teachers who are teaching behavior with their behavior data that they collect daily, and then using that data to actually teach responsible behavior with students, are able to align that with the Common Core in writing, speaking, listening, and all of those things, especially as also with college and career readiness skills, with problem solving and speaking in public. So all of those things can be wrapped together, and those are some great uses for behavior data. And of course, it makes life easier in the classroom. That's probably the primary point that everyone looks at. But teachers use data effectively every day. However, I think we all know that it's a real tendency to use data just to label, and that's not really what we want it for. We need data to use in order to solve problems and make change. So let's just take a quick peek at the multi-tiered systems of support. And I always like to think of a sandcastle, because it reminds me that Tier 1 is our solid foundation. And if we really haven't addressed that first, we'll have a lot of difficulty maintaining and sustaining Tier 2 and 3 interventions. And this is for behavior or academics. But I want us to really focus on this whole group to make sure that we're very efficient and that we don't just automatically go to students who have referrals and those kind of things. It's not just that data, it's all of the data. So as we move forward here, you can see a problem-solving cycle, and we obviously note that data guides effective intervention through problem-solving. Many of you are probably really familiar with problem-solving and that process, and the most popular problem-solving process really defines 4 out of these 5 steps. And I just simply added the create a monitoring plan, because I wanted to make sure that we realize that not only do we define a problem and ask about why is this problem occurring, and then what can we do to create an intervention plan, but that we also very specifically and purposefully create a monitoring plan so that we can evaluate results appropriately. So again, this kind of problem-solving cycle and process will help us answer questions like you see on the left-hand side. Is Tier 1 effective for 80% of our students? And that's why we start at that level at the bottom there. And why is this problem occurring? And can we actually group students for intervention based on our data? So let's look at some examples of this. And I'm going to start with the idea first that teachers do use data effectively every day. I think one of our questions was, do teachers actually use data? Well, I submit that all of you teachers know that you have to use data on a daily basis. But I wanted to give you a real-life example of a team, a grade-level team in a middle school where I was working with this past year. They were a school that had positive behavior support in their school for several years. But this team of teachers at 7th grade noticed that they had many referrals. And so they realized that something wasn't quite working right if they were trying to do PBS, and they still had lots of referrals. Their idea through problem solving was that really it needed greater student buy-in. So they decided to survey their students, their whole team of students, and discovered that indeed they didn't really have maybe the right rewards and recognition set up for their students. So based on their survey results, they created what you see in that picture there, a recognition and reward menu. And you can see it was cheap too. The whole idea of that is that They started with a strong Tier 1, and because of that, it really allowed this team to move forward in solving more specific problems using a working PBIS system, as opposed to one that was kind of broken and students weren't buying in. If they had jumped right to a Tier 2 behavior and intervention, they probably would have missed a big piece of what would actually work. So let's move on to part 2 of the story. So part 2 of the story, they decided, as they looked closely at further problems, that many students frequently teased other students in the classroom, and many times that led to bullying or fighting. They showed respect for teachers, but not for each other. So when they went to define the problem, they asked themselves these questions and realized they didn't really have an idea of how often this was happening. Was it all students or just a few, and all those kind of things. So they took a week as a team to observe and record the number of times this occurred and students, so that they could kind of see if this is a big problem or is this just a few kids. Then they took some time to analyze the problem. They did, in fact, after they did that baseline check, realize that it was most students, so it wasn't just a few. So they decided to treat it as a Tier 1 situation, so they wanted to do something for all students. And they realized, they thought, well, if we teach them these strategies, the students will be less likely to do those teasings in class. So moving right along with the intervention then, they decided that they would use LEAPS, since they were already using that as a school, as part of the classroom assessment, and then teach LEAPS lessons in extended homerooms twice a week. That was the intervention. And then the monitoring plan was a weekly count of the number of occurrences, just the way they did it at the very beginning to get the baseline. Moving on to the next section, they took a look at their results, graphed their data, and realized that, asked themselves these questions: was this intervention effective for at least 80%? And their answers were yes. And then based on those results, they decided we still had students that weren't getting with the program here, and they needed further intervention, needed to go deeper into some of these lessons. But now they could see, hey, let's make this a Tier 2 intervention for those who need support, and those would be our next steps. So that's kind of an example of how to wrap this around and use problem solving. As part of the next steps, these teachers decided, well, to plan for recovery and reteaching in small groups. This is kind of how we would organize that. So they did this as part of their reading classes, their language arts classes, and as they had small groups, they would use some behavior content as part of that to teach their Common Core.
Thank you, Pam. The next question is for both of our guests. Can we demonstrate data collection for problem solving?
Well, there's lots of data, Julia, and that's probably one of the hardest things for people to overcome at the beginning of this whole process. Which data do we look at for what? So let's just kind of review some of the expansive data that we have. We have, for behavior, office discipline referrals. We have number of instances of something occurring, time duration of behavior, observation, self-assessment of students, behavior rubrics is another way to measure behavior, and then pre and post assessment. So all of those behavior and those data can lead us to positive solutions if we use them appropriately. And I want to turn this over to Jay, because Jay, you have some good examples of this with LEAPS.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. One of the things you can look at is how you explicitly use data. And for example, most of the folks on today are LEAPS folks, and so let's just use that as an example. There are multiple assessments available within LEAPS, and one of the things you need to hear is that as we move from into this RTI and into an MTSS model, that multi-tiered system of supports, the movement within those tiers from gen ed to small group and even into individual, you have to be able to manage the resources necessary for each of those levels. The best way of doing that is through an assessing process that allows for a quantification of functioning of the student. If you can't quantify it or place value to it, it's really hard to determine your entrance criteria, therefore your benchmarks, therefore your exiting criteria. So for example, in LEAPS there are multiple types of assessments available: informant, interview, and self. Well, the assessment should provide you with the data necessary to make those choices. And so just as an example, here's a LEAPS profile, and you'll see up in the upper left-hand corner, the first thing it's going to do is tell you the student's overall functioning level, give a correlation interpretation as to what that means, And that gives you the functioning level to determine, is this a student who might need small group based on functioning, or someone who's doing well in Tier 1. Then you go from there and you have to break down and not just use a general overriding Tier 2 is necessary, but what in Tier 2? So from a behavioral standpoint, you begin breaking it down into categories. Part of your behavior improvement plan is you're supposed to graph where the kids are. So let's look at strengths, let's look at deficits. It's in a line graph and in a scatter plot. These things are things that we can call a strength that we don't necessarily need intervention for. However, the closer we get over here on the left, those are the deficit areas. And then for small groups, so that we understand how to create small group, we actually take the numerical representation of the student's progress, and that helps us align kids who have similar needs into groups so that the groups are based upon actual behaviors, actual etiology of behavior, and not just presentation. More importantly, what that does then is it says this is what you need to teach the student, and it'll actually break down from a curricula standpoint. And when you have that, what you've been able to do is measure the student's functioning level, determine what you're going to do about it, get the content necessary to create engagement opportunities, and then go in and reassess. And what you end up with is, for example, this is actual data last year from a large district in Florida. And so when we aggregated where their students were at the beginning of the year from these categorical perspectives, you'll see here's where their functioning levels were. By the end of the year, here's where they were. And so what you have there is a true statement of progress that's numerically represented. In other words, it's quantified progress that you can then in turn say, okay, that then represents a specific level of progress. You can break that down to the individual student, roll it up to a small group, take it to a grade level, apply it to a building, or in this case, roll it all the way up to the district. And that gives you that, once again, numerical, quantifiable, representative data that not only told you what to do about the student, but when you have data that tells you what to do with the student, that data should in turn feed the progress monitoring process, which is so important. And then as Pam was saying, there are things you can do daily along the ways, whether it's rubrics that you've taught a lesson, now we're going to see the application of those skills, all the way up into the assessments that give you real hard, evidentiary, discrete data that allows for measurement opportunities.
Great. Thank you, Pam and Jay. This next question again is for both of you. How can we ensure fidelity with data results?
Thank you, Julia. Fidelity is talking really about, are we doing what we say we're doing, and how can we show that? That's one of the meanings of fidelity. So I'm going to start at the teacher level. And at the teacher level, if I'm doing intervention groups, one of the things that I would want to make sure that I could prove is that the students in my group are indeed receiving the intervention on specific days, so that when we come to the end of the intervention and we look at results, post-test results, for example, or how well this the new behaviors have been applied in a regular classroom setting, then we can see if Johnny has missed 5 of the 10 days of intervention, we can't say that he really hasn't learned it. We need to give him a little more time. So this helps us with some of that type of thing and that kind of fidelity part. And Jay, I'm going to turn it over to you to show some other examples of fidelity.
Okay, thanks, Pam. Fidelity is one of those things that really confuses a lot of our teachers. Now, our administrators who have been part of the planning and preparation oftentimes have a good idea of what they want to measure, but it's hard to grasp fidelity from an operational or a programmatic standpoint. So let's just give some brass tacks examples. If you have programming designated for Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, these are points that you need to be able to identify and report on. The first one's the saturation level, and you need that so you can look at across time comparisons. So for example, again, this is a large district in Miami that's using LEAPS, and so in the school year 2010-11, they started with 202 licensees, but what we look at is by the end of the school year 2011, they had 791. And so from a saturation standpoint, we saw continued growth of the folks who were involved in programming that was designated for behavioral, social, and emotional. Well, the next thing we did is we took that saturation and you look at how often are they utilizing programs. And because Leaps is cloud-based, what we can look at is just real simply, how often are they logging in? And does the login tend to hold over time? You see a growth from a low point of 44 logins to a high point of 940. And then more importantly than even logins, how often are they accessing the actual content or resources? And so you look at a year one access point of anywhere from 56 to 624 lessons during that first year, all the way up to the second year, during the start of the school year at 287 and the high point of 1,367. So our saturation grew, our logins were growing, the number of lesson plans accessed were growing, and what that does, it provides a representation of fidelity. But think about response to intervention. Everything is always put on the kids. But if your teachers don't buy into it from a fidelity standpoint, you're not going to have the results you want. And so what you measure is, are your teachers satisfied with the actual content of programming? And so, for example, once again in this district, we looked at, are the teachers satisfied with content overall, ease of use, age appropriateness, realism, and accuracy? In other words, those very specific satisfaction points that say, the big one, are teachers going to come back and use this again? And you'll see we have a 96% show rate that says absolutely, with nearly 60% saying it's an excellent opportunity that they will. And then you also look at that for overall programming. And overall programming means everything from the look and the feel to the way it's delivered and everywhere in between. Now, the point of doing all of this is think back to those progress monitoring statements. You can't really claim progress if you can't demonstrate fidelity. So to be able to show we have an instrument we've decided is what we're going to use, we've implemented it across X number of licensees or users, this is how often they're accessing programs, this is what they're doing with it. Then the assessment data that points out, here's our students' functioning levels, then the recommendation on lessons to teach, the tracking of when those lessons were taught, then the post-participation assessment, now we have progress monitoring, then we take that fidelity data to support progress monitoring. And all of those sound like a lot of reports, but if it's done correctly, all of that is accomplished by literally a teacher logging on, choosing the lesson they need to teach, assessing the student, and basically going back and just clicking off that they taught the lesson, and at the end of the year reassessing the student. Then all those reports in between are created by the system, which gives you, here's our fidelity, and from the fidelity foundation, here's our progress. That's how you use data to create real teaching opportunities, and more importantly, measurable and reportable teaching opportunities.
Great. Thank you, Jay and Pam. That was wonderful. I appreciate all of our guests coming today. Hopefully that was helpful for each of you. Again, that was Jay Burcham with Provenio Group, developer of Leaps, and Dr. Pam Brunig, CEO of Progressive Bridges, who is an education services company. We encourage you, if you have questions, give us a call or send us an email. We'd be glad to help you. And don't forget, put your calendar on for January 14th, Simple Documentation and Data Collection Strategies. Thank you very much for coming.